Okay. Okay. We are on. Okay. We are on
37B.
37B. 37B. Not just somewhere, but we're 4 lines from the bottom. Bishlama, last word on the line. Okay. So if you recall, the Gemara had a discussion about the words Moshav. Moshav, your settlement. Okay, does Moshav intend to mean that it means any place where you are settled? So it means even outside of Eretz Yisrael. Or is Moshav intended to mean when you are settled in the land? So to the contrary, it means only when they're in Eretz Yisrael and only subsequent to the 14 years of conquering and settling the land. So 2 very different meanings of the word Moshav. So the Gemara says, Bishlam Lamanda Omar Moshav Kol Makom Sha'atim Yoshvim Mashma. So it makes sense, according to the opinion that Moshav intends to mean that anywhere where you are settled. Okay, so again, it's not excluding Chutz La'aretz. It's not excluding outside of Eretz Yisrael. To the contrary, it's going to include outside of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, Hainu D'chsiv. Then now it makes sense that the pasuk writes, "Vayochlu me'avur haaretz mimacharas haPesach," that they began to eat from the produce of the land. This is a pasuk in Yehoshua, so it's describing Klal Yisrael upon their entrance to the land of Eretz Yisrael, and it says that they began to eat from the produce of the land, matzos v'kaloi. They ate matzah made from wheat and kaloi and roasted wheat kernels. So they began to eat from the produce of the land, mimachras haPesach, from the day, excuse me, from the day outside after Pesach. The day after Pesach. What's significant about the day after Pesach? So the second day of Pesach is the day which we bring the Korban Omer, right? So it means that they only began to eat the produce of the land, right, once they had brought the Korban Omer, right? Now, this is describing right upon their entrance to the land, right? It's immediately upon their entrance to the land, long before the 14 years had passed. Right? So you see that they kept the halacha of Chadash, that the produce was forbidden until the second day of Pesach, even though they had not yet settled the land. Okay, so that seems to make sense according to the opinion that the prohibition applied immediately. Okay, Mimacharas haPesach achol, from on the bottom line, Mimacharas haPesach achol, from the second day of Pesach they were permitted to eat meikara lo achol. So but prior to that they were not permitted to eat. Alma, going on to 38a, Alma akriv omer v'hadar achol. You see that they were required to bring the korban omer, and only then were they permitted to eat. Right, so that means that the prohibition of Chadash applied even though they had not yet settled the land, which fits with the opinion that the word Moshav is coming to mean anywhere where you are settled, and it's not excluding Chutz La'aretz. Ella, however, Lamanda Amar, according to the opinion La'achar Yerusha v'Yeshiva, that the prohibition of Chadash only took effect after they had settled the land. So Nechol La'alter, right? So Nechol La'alter, they should have been permitted to eat the produce immediately. The produce should have been permitted immediately because the prohibition of Chadash did not take effect until 14 years later. Right? Until 14 years later. So says the Gemara, you're right. They were permitted to eat from it. Lo havit tzrichi. However, the pasuk is telling me that they didn't need it. Okay? Why didn't they need it? Right? What were they eating if they didn't have the produce of the land? So Rashi explains that they still had leftover man until the second day of Pesach. So they still had leftover man that lasted until the second day of Pesach. And what the pasuk is telling me is they did not need the produce of the land. Which when did they need the produce of the land? It happens to coincide with the second day of Pesach, but it had nothing to do with the Korban Omer. Okay, Tichsiv. Where do we see that they didn't need it? T'chsiv uvnei Yisrael achlu es haman 40 shana ad boam el eretz noshaves. Es haman achlu ad boam el katzei eretz Canaan. Okay. So the pasuk says, this is a pasuk in Shemos, which describes the falling of the man when the man was first introduced to Klal Yisrael, and it says that they ate the man for 40 years until they arrived al eretz noshaves, until they arrived to the settled land. Okay. And then it says that they ate the man until they arrived until the borders of Eretz Canaan. Okay? So it seems to contradict itself, right? Did the man end when they were still on the western side, on the eastern side of the border of Eretz Yisrael, meaning before they had crossed the Yarden, before they had crossed the Jordan River, or did the man last until after they had entered the Jordan River, after they had crossed the Jordan River and entered Eretz Yisrael? Okay. So did the man end before or after? So you can't say that it means that that it lasted until they had crossed the Jordan into Eretz Yisrael, because the pasuk says that it lasted only until they were at the border, right, still on the eastern side. And you can't say that it lasted only until they were on the eastern side, but before they had crossed, because the pasuk says it lasted until they had entered the land. So it seems to contradict itself. Okay, how do we resolve this contradiction? B'shiva ba'adar meis Moshe. Moshe died on the 7th of Adar. Okay, upasak man milered, and at that point, that the pasuk is teaching me that the man fell for Klal Yisrael. The man was given to Klal Yisrael b'schus Moshe, in the merit of Moshe, and upon Moshe's death, the man ceased to fall. It was no longer man that came. And they were able to eat from the man, even though until then the man lasted only for 1 day. Right, the man would not remain. Right, any man that remained would rot. Right, would spoil and would rot. Nevertheless, upon Moshe's death, the man that had fallen, that man lasted for the next 40 days, right, from the 7th of Adar until the 16th of Nisan. Right? Tanya Idach, we learned in a brisa, Ovnei Yisrael achlu asaman 40 shana. The Jews ate from the man for 40 years. So the Gemara asks, is it true that they ate for 40 years? So the Gemara is very punctilious. The Gemara is very exacting, and the Gemara says that is it true that they ate for 40 years? It was 40 years minus 30 days. Okay. Why? Because the man only began to fall after they had been in the desert for 30 days. Okay? Meaning, upon leaving Egypt, they had sufficient food that was left that they took with them to last for 30 days, and only then do we find the pasuk in the Torah which describes how the Jews had no food left, right, and they began to complain, and then the man fell. So that was only 30 days after, right? So it was 40 years minus 30 days, and we know that the Torah is very exact. So how could the Torah say 40 years if it was missing 30 days? Rather, it's coming to teach me ugos shehotziu mi Mitzrayim ta'amu bahem ta'am man. Okay, so it's teaching me that the food that they had taken with them, the cakes or the matzah that they had taken with them from Mitzrayim, was already given the flavor of the man. Even though it certainly was not man, it was physical food. Nevertheless, it already had the flavor of man, and therefore we count it as 40 complete years, even though it was not actually man for the first 30 days. Okay? So a different interpretation of the 40 years. Tanya Idach, we learned in a different brisa. B'shiva ba'adar meis Moshe. Moshe died on the 7th of Adar. Or b'shiva ba'adar nolad, and he was born on the 7th of Adar as well. Minayin, what's the source for this? How do we know this? Minayin shebeshiva ba'adar meis. How do we know he died on the 7th of Adar? Shenemar Vayamas Sham Moshe Eved Hashem. The pasuk says, this is at the end of V'zos HaBracha, the last few psukim of the Torah, and it says that Moshe, the servant of Hashem, died there. And then the pasuk immediately after that says, "Vayivku b'nei Yisrael es Moshe ba'arvos Moav shloshim yom," and the Jews mourned for Moshe ba'arvos Moav in the desert of Moab for 30 days. Okay, Moshe Eved Hashem, and then subsequent to that in Yehoshua it says that after the death of Moshe, Moshe Avdi Meis. Moshe, my servant, has died. Hashem instructs Yoshua. And now, kum avor, go and cross over the Jordan River. Ivru bekerev hamachane. Tzavu es ha'am leimor. Travel, go through the camp, pass through the camp, and command the nation, saying, Achinu lachem tzeda, prepare for yourself supplies. Ki ba'od shloshes yamim ta'avu es ha'yarden. Because in 3 days' time, you're going to cross the Jordan River. Uchsiv. And when did they actually cross the Jordan River? So this is sort of a complicated calculation here. But essentially, what are we going to say? They crossed the Jordan River on the 10th of Nisan. Okay? So they crossed the Jordan River on the 10th of Nisan. Okay? And 3 days prior to that is when Hashem instructed them to prepare for that. So that means the 7th of Nisan. Right, 3 days prior to the 10th of Nisan. Semehem shloshim ushlosha yamim. And then 30 days prior to that, they had been mourning the death of Moshe. So that adds up to 33 days. Okay, so minus 33 days from the 10th of Nisan, and you're left with the 7th of Adar. Okay, so 3 days prior to crossing the Jordan is when they began to prepare. That was the 7th of Nisan. Okay. For the month prior to that, they had been mourning the death of Moshe. So that means Moshe died on the 7th of Adar. Halamadta shebeshiva ba'adar meis. So you see that beshiva ba'adar meis. Moshe on the 7th of Adar, Moshe died. Okay. So it says, okay, we accept that proof that Moshe died on the 7th of Adar. Okay. Halamadta shebeshiva ba'adar meis Moshe. Uminayin. How do we know what's the source? Shebeshiva ba'adar nolad Moshe. But what's the source to say that on the 7th of Adar Moshe was born? How do we know that? Nowhere in the Torah does it say that the Moshe's birthday. Shenemar vayomer aleim, as the pasuk says, Moshe said to them, saying, "Ben mea va'esrim shana anochi hayom, la'uchal od latzeis v'lavo." Okay, Moshe said to the Jewish nation, Moshe said to Am Yisrael, "I am 120 years today. Okay. I can no longer go and come. He didn't have to say today. He could have said I'm 120 years old. Right? Why did he have to specify today I'm 120 years old? Okay. So why does it say today? So what it means to tell me is that he's exactly 120 years old. And that day was the day he turned 120. Now, what day was that? We know this is the last day of his life. This is V'zos HaBracha. This is the last day of his life when he blessed Klal Yisrael. So you see that he turned 120 exactly on the last day of his life. Malamed is teaching me Shakadosh Baruch Hu Yoshev u'Mamale Shenoseim Shel Tzadikim Miyom Liyom u'Mechodesh Lechodesh. You see that Hakadosh Baruch Hu calculates exactly the years of the tzaddikim, the life of tzaddikim, from day to day and from month to month. That it's very exact. Shenema is mispar yomecha amale, the counting of your days I shall fill. That Hakadosh Baruch Hu fills the lives of tzaddikim exactly to the day, to the moment that Moshe had exactly turned 120 that day. So you see that Moshe was born on the 7th of Adar. Okay. Tanya, Reb Shimon ben Yochai Omer. So now we're going back to the discussion of mitzvos that apply in Eretz Yisrael, exclusively in Eretz Yisrael, versus mitzvos that apply even in Chutz La'aretz, even outside of Eretz Yisrael. Okay. So Tanya, we learned in a brisa. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, Shalosh mitzvos nitztavu Yisrael b'chnisasan la'aretz v'nohagos bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says there were 3 mitzvos that Klal Yisrael was nitztavu, they were commanded bichnisasan la'aretz, when they entered Eretz Yisrael. Okay? And nevertheless, v'nohagos ben ba'aretz ben b'chutz la'aretz. And nevertheless, even though we said that generally mitzvos that they were given when they entered Eretz Yisrael apply only in Eretz Yisrael, nevertheless, these three mitzvos apply both in Eretz Yisrael and outside Eretz Yisrael. Okay? And it makes sense. Okay, it makes sense halachically that they should apply both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. How does it make sense? Umach chodosh, meaning that we can extrapolate this. Umach chodosh she'ein isuro isur olam, ve'ein isuro isur hana, v'yesh heter le'isuro. That if we take the prohibition of chadash, which we had already established, that the prohibition of chadash applies b'chol moshvosechem, in all your dwelling places, which means to include even chutz la'aretz, right? So that we had already established on the last daf that chadash applies both in Eretz Yisrael and in chutz la'aretz. Okay? Now, if that's the case, if we use that as the source, we can then apply a kal v'chomer. Okay? What do we know about chadash? What are the characteristics of chadash? It's ein isur isur olam. It's not a prohibition that lasts forever. Okay? What does that mean? It doesn't last forever. So what does it mean it doesn't last forever?
After the
There's a date that ends.
Has a date that it ends. Has a date that it ends. It ends on the 16th of Nisan, right? It doesn't last forever. Meaning the grain, which is chadash, right, will then become what we call yashan, right? Now it's and then it's permitted. Ve'eni surah iser hana'a. It's not forbidden to benefit from. Okay, you're permitted to use it for animal feed. Okay, or whatever you might want to use with it. It's only prohibited to eat. So it's not an isur hana. V'yesh heter le'isuro. Okay, and you are able to permit. There's a way to permit that which is forbidden, namely by bringing the korban omer. Okay, so by bringing the korban omer, that is what permits the grain to be eaten. Okay, so meaning you have the ability to permit that which is forbidden. And nevertheless, despite the fact that it has these three leniencies that apply, noheg ben ba'aretz ben b'chutz la'aretz. It applies both in Eretz Yisrael and in chutz la'aretz. Right? Now, therefore, we can make a kal v'chomer to two other prohibitions. Kalayim, okay, the prohibition of kalayim, of grafting, and here Rashi explains that what we're referring to is specifically kilai hakerem, to planting wheat or to planting other species in a vineyard. Okay, she'isurin isur olam, that which grows from this forbidden mixture of kalayim is forbidden forever. There's no way to permit that which grows; it's forbidden forever. Ve'isurin isur hana, okay, and it is forbidden to benefit from. Okay, you're not permitted to benefit from it whatsoever. Okay, as the pasuk says, "Pentiktash hamalea," that which will grow will be. The pasuk says tiktash, which we then interpret to mean tukad eish, that it shall be burnt in fire. Okay, that you have to burn it. It becomes forbidden to benefit from. You have to destroy it. Okay? So again, it's forbidden forever. And it's forbidden to benefit from. Now, this is specific to kalai hakerem. Other kalayim, other forbidden mixtures are permitted to benefit from. But kalai hakerem, that forbidden mixtures in a vineyard, that is forbidden to benefit from. Ve'ein heter li'isuro, and there's no way to permit that which is forbidden. Okay? Once it becomes forbidden, then there's no way to permit it. Einodin sheyinagu ben ba'aretz ben b'chutz la'aretz. So does it not make sense that by kal v'chomer, that it should apply both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz? So again, if Chadash, which is more lenient, applies both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz, so Kol Shekain, it's a Kal V'chomer, that this should apply both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. Okay? So now we extend this prohibition to Kilaya Kerem, to forbidden mixtures in a vineyard. Hadin la'orla b'shtayim, and we can further extend it to the prohibition of orla, which is the first 3 years that a person plants a tree. Any fruits which are produced are forbidden. Okay. Now orla only has two of these characteristics. Okay? It doesn't have all three characteristics, but it does have two of them, okay? Which is that it's forbidden to benefit from, okay? And there's no way to permit that which is forbidden. Okay, so Orla is forbidden to benefit from. You're not allowed to use that produce whatsoever. Okay, and there's no way to permit that which is forbidden, right? So it has those two characteristics, right? However, it does not have the third, right? Because it's not Isur Olam. It's not forbidden forever, right? Orla extends only for 3 years, right? Oh. It's only for 3 years, right? So it's not something which is forbidden forever. Okay, so nevertheless, it has two stringencies that that Chadash does not have, and therefore we can make a Kal V'chomer here as well that Orla should apply both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. Okay. Now, Tosfos sort of takes issue a little bit with Rashi's interpretation, okay? Because what are we saying? Any surah isur olam that Orla. That is not a prohibition that lasts forever, right? Tosfos says that produce which is forbidden, right, remains forbidden forever. Okay, so Tosfos is not thrilled with Rashi's interpretation because Tosfos says that that produce which is forbidden, right, that remains forbidden forever. So we should still call that isur olam. Okay, so the Hiksha Rabbeinu Tam Harei Haprisha Gadol V'Shnei Orla Asur LaOlam Ve'en Lo Heter. Right. That so we should apply all three. Okay. So Tosfos has a different interpretation. Tosfos says it's referring to the fourth year. Okay. The fourth year, is what we call neta revai. Okay. That produce which grows in the fourth year, and that has a very special halacha. It's similar to Ma'aser Sheni. It has to be taken up to Yerushalayim, okay, and eaten with kedusha. It has the same sort of holiness, similar to Ma'aser Sheni. You have to eat it in Yerushalayim, okay, near the Beit Hamikdash. Very essentially almost the same as Ma'aser Sheni. Okay, the same halachos. It has kedusha. There's a certain holiness. It has to be eaten there. Okay. So Tosfos says it's referring to the fourth year. Okay? So which halachos to apply? That it's forbidden to benefit from unless you take it to Yerushalayim, right? And it's remains forbidden forever, but it's yesh heter li'isura. There's a way to permit it, right? How do you permit it? By taking it up to Yerushalayim and eating it there. So Tosfos has a different interpretation that it's forbidden. A different interpretation that it's referring to the fourth year, not referring to the 3 years. Okay, but regardless, we're saying that Orla has two stringencies that Chadash does not, and therefore we should make a Kal V'chomer that Orla should apply in Chutz La'aretz just like Chadash. Okay. So again, the three prohibitions that we're discussing here is Chadash, okay, Kilai HaKeren, forbidden mixtures in the vineyard, and Orla, the first 3 years that a tree grows. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shimon says on the very last line, turning on to 38b. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shimon Omer. He says, "Kol mitzvah shenitztavu Yisrael kodem knisas la'aretz." Any mitzvah which Klal Yisrael was commanded in. Meaning, not only were they commanded, because all mitzvahs were given in the desert during the 40 years in the desert when the Torah was given, right? They were commanded in all mitzvahs. But what we mean to say is any mitzvahs that they were commanded to already begin keeping, right? Before Kodem Knisas La'aretz, before they had entered the land. No heges ben ba'aretz ben b'chutz la'aretz. So therefore, those mitzvahs apply both in Eretz Yisrael and in chutz la'aretz. If they were commanded to already keep them before they had entered the land of Eretz Yisrael, right, that's teaching me that mitzvah is going to apply, right? That mitzvah is not dependent on the land, and that mitzvah is going to apply both in Eretz Yisrael and chutz la'aretz. La'achar knisas la'aretz, but any mitzvah which they were only commanded to begin keeping upon entering the land, so that's teaching me that mitzvah only applies in Eretz Yisrael. La'achar knisas la'aretz, eina noheges ela ba'aretz. So that if they were only commanded to begin keeping it once they had entered the land, then it's only going to apply in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, with two exceptions, of course. Chutz min hashmatas kesafim v'shiluach avadim. Right, there always has to be an exception. Absolutely. So the exception here is hashmatas kesafim, what we call shmitas kesafim, right, which is a very important halacha that we still keep nowadays. That a person has to, that all loans that a person has are canceled out in the Shemitah year. Okay?
But that isn't a. What's the status on applicability of that today?
It applies. Absolutely.
Yeah, this canceling of.
So we have a workaround, which was developed by Hillel, that's called a pruzbul. Okay, pruzbul is a specific document where a person transfers the loan to Bezdin. Person transfers the loan to a Bezdin, and any loans which are administered by a Bezdin, those are not canceled out. Okay? Meaning the halacha applies only to individual loans, not loans that are administered by a Bezdin. Okay? And therefore, by transferring it to the Bezdin, then a person is permitted to collect upon that loan even after Shemitah. Okay. Now Hillel had a very good reason for establishing that. Essentially, what began to happen was that even though the Torah is very, very strong in its wording, the Torah says, "Be careful, lest you have an evil thought, that you'll think to yourself that karva shnasa sheva shnasa shmita, that the Shemitah year is getting close. I don't want to lend any money any longer, right? Because I might not be able to collect upon it. So what happens when a poor person comes and they need a loan, right? The wealthy person is going to say no, right? And the Torah admonishes us very, very strongly. The Torah says that don't do that, right? You're forbidden from doing that. You have to open your hand and give him the money, right? Nevertheless, despite the Torah's very, very strong admonition, right? Admonishment, the Torah, nevertheless, that began to happen. That people were no longer lending money, right? So Hillel saw that actually what was intended by the Torah to protect the borrower, that the loans are canceled out, was actually working against them because they could no longer borrow any money. Okay? Now, what's interesting about this was that, as we're going to see, Shemitah, okay, subsequent to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, was only D'Rabbanan. Okay, because since we no longer kept Yovel, which Yovel did not apply because we were no longer living, we didn't have the majority of Eretz Yisrael in the land, of the people settled in the land, so Shemitah was only D'Rabbanan. So what began to happen was that people were violating an Isur D'Oraisa of not lending money, right, for the sake of an Isur D'Rabbanan. Okay. So meaning they were violating an Isur D'Oraisa of refusing to lend money, right, because of an Isur D'Rabbanan, right? So Hillel said we have to do something about this, right? We need to do something to help the borrowers, that they should be allowed to, people should be willing to lend them money.
And protect the bank. Like
right?
an FDIC.
No, but the intent of it was to protect the borrower, right? To help the borrowers, because nobody was lending them any money. So Hillel said he made a takana called the pruzbul, which allows the lender to still collect on his loan afterwards, right? And now people were willing to lend money again. Okay, so Hillel did this to protect really to help the borrower. Okay? Now, however, without that workaround, Shmitas Kesafim does apply. Right? Nowadays it's only D'Rabbanan because Shemitah is only D'Rabbanan, but at the time that Shemitah applied D'Oraisa, that Shmitas Kesafim, right, the canceling of the loans, applied even in Chutz La'aretz D'Oraisa.
Is Shemitah in regards to produce in Israel still D'Oraisa?
No,
that's D'Rabbanan.
Right.
Correct.
Nowadays it's only D'Rabbanan, right? But
outside Israel,
so outside of Eretz Yisrael, there's no prohibition of Shemitah regarding produce, right? There's no Shemitah. We don't calculate the 7 years and the produce doesn't become forbidden. There's no halacha of Shemitah, but Shemitah's Kesafim does apply. But this canceling of the loans does apply. Okay? So Shemitah is still relevant to us in Chutz La'aretz regarding the regarding canceling of the loans, even though it's not relevant regarding agriculture regarding the produce of the land, okay? Which is exactly what the Gemara is saying here. Chutz min shmitas kasafim, that the canceling of the loans applies both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz, even though when did it begin to take effect? Only after they entered the land, right? Not only after
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Doesn't the rules regarding the consumption of Shemitah produce apply to people who are living outside Israel?
But only produce that grew in Eretz Yisrael.
Right, but it still applies to, I mean, if you order something from Israel, like we used to order oranges, Jaffa oranges, and we quit being able to do that, I think, because of the Shemitah year.
Correct. What I meant to say is that it only applies to produce grown in Eretz Yisrael as opposed to produce grown in Chutz La'aretz. Right. Right. Correct. Thank you for pointing that out. Right. What we mean to say is it only applies to produce grown in Eretz Yisrael as opposed to produce grown in Chutz La'aretz. Correct. Well, once that produce is produce from Eretz Yisrael, then the prohibition would apply even in Chutz La'aretz. Yes, you're 100% correct on that. Right. So hashmatas kasafim, right, the canceling of the loans, that applies both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. Vishiluach avadim, and this that one has to send their slaves free. Okay, so this that one has to send their slaves free in Yovel, that applies both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. She'af al pishen itztavu aleim la'achar knisasan la'aretz noheges bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. So those apply both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. Okay, even though they did not go into effect until they had actually settled the land, because Shemitah only took effect then. Yovel only took effect after they had settled the land. Right. Nevertheless, these two halachos apply even in Chutz La'aretz during the time that Shemitah and Yovel applied in Eretz Yisrael. When it became Shemitah in Eretz Yisrael, loans were canceled in Chutz La'aretz. When it became Yovel in Eretz Yisrael, then slaves had to be freed, had to be emancipated, even in Chutz La'aretz.
We're talking about being in Israel. We're still using the 14 years after the additional 14 years, or is it from exactly when they?
So Shemitah and Yovel, if I remember correctly, only began to take effect after the 14 years, right? Only once they had actually settled the land, because we need Kol Yoshvei Allah. We need that the land should be settled by all the tribes, that each tribe should be in its proper place. Okay, in their proper portion, which is only at the end of the 14 years. Right? So asks the Gemara, now 6 lines down, Hashmatas Kesafim Chovas Hagufi. Says the Gemara, wait a minute, canceling of loans, right, has nothing to do with the land. It's nothing to do with agriculture, right? It's a halacha, which is Chovas Haguf. It's a mitzvah that applies to an individual, to a person, right? It has nothing to do with the land. Okay? So it should be obvious to us that that should apply even in Chutz La'aretz. Okay? Should be obvious to us that should apply even in Chutz La'aretz, right? Why do I need a brisa to come and teach me? Why do I need Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon to come and teach me that it applies even in Chutz La'aretz? That should be obvious to us. Okay, says the Gemara, Lo nitzricha ela l'kedetanya. I need it because of a brisa. Detanya, we learned in the brisa, Rebbe Omer, v'zeh devar hashemita. This is the law of the Shemitah. Shamot, that you shall cancel all loans. Okay? So the pasuk says, "V'zeh devar hashmita shamot kol bal ma sheyado sheyashe b're'eu." That this is the halacha of the Shemitah, that all loans should be canceled out. Okay? Now, what does that teach me? The Torah is teaching me that there are two parallel halachos of Shemitah. Achas Shmitas karka, v'achas Shmitas kesafim. One is the Shemitah of the land, of the produce of the land. The other is the Shemitah of loans, of money. Okay, and the Torah is drawing a parallel between them. That's teaching me bisman she'ata meshamet karka, ata meshamet kesafim. That the halacha of canceling loans only applies for as long as the halacha of Shemitah applies to the produce of the land. Okay. However, bisman she'iyata meshamet karka, iyata meshamet kesafim. Okay. However, once the halacha of Shemitah no longer applies to agriculture, to the produce, it no longer applies to loans either. Okay. Now, this is teaching me a halacha. This brisa is teaching me a halacha that shmitas kesafim only applies for as long as shmitas karka applies. Okay, which again, mita oraisa only applies for as long as yovel applies. Right, which is telling me that subsequent to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, Shemitah was no longer d'oraisa. So on a Torah level, Shemitah no longer applied, and similarly on a Torah level, the canceling of loans no longer applied either. Right? We keep it nowadays midrabanan, right? And similarly, we keep the halacha of canceling loans midrabanan as well, right? But on a Torah level, that ended, right, with the end of Shemitah. Okay. Now, I might have thought ve'ema. I would have thought to say perhaps if the Torah is drawing a parallel between shmitas karka, between the shmita of the produce and the shmita of the loans, I would have thought that maybe it not only applies chronologically to the time, but I might have thought ve'ema b'makom shata meshamet karka ata meshamet kesafim. Perhaps the Torah is telling me that shmitas kesafim, that canceling of the loans, even though it's what we call a chovas haguf, even though it's something which is not dependent on the land, maybe the Torah is drawing a parallel and it's telling me that it only applies in the same place where the shemitah of the land of the produce applies, meaning in Eretz Yisrael, right? But in a place where the halachos of shemitah of the land does not apply, I might have thought that there the shemitah of the loans does not apply either. Okay, Talmud lomar kikara shemitah laHashem mikol makam. Therefore, the Torah tells me kikara shemitah laHashem because you have declared a shemitah for Hashem, which is telling me that it's not dependent upon the land, right? And therefore, it applies even in chutz la'aretz. So, what the Gemara is answering is that even though it's a chovas haguf, even though you're right, it's not a mitzvah which is dependent upon the land. I might have thought that we should make a drasha, that we should learn out that it should be dependent upon the land, that it only applies in a place where you keep shemitah of the land. Only there are you obligated to keep shemitah of money, of loans as well. And therefore, I need the brisa to teach me that it applies even in chutz la'aretz, even outside of Eretz Yisrael. Okay. Asks the Gemara now on the second halacha. This halacha that all slaves must be emancipated, must be set free in Yovel, right? Asks the Gemara, Shiluach Avodim Chovas Hagufi, right? That too is a Chovas Haguf, right? It's not dependent upon the land. There's nothing to do with agriculture, right? So that too, why do I need a brisa to tell me that it applies even to Chutz La'aretz, right? That should be obvious to us. It's a Chovas Haguf. Says the Gemara, Sal Kedai Tachamina. I might have thought as follows. Since the pasuk says, "Ukrasem dror ba'aretz l'chol yosheveha," you shall declare freedom, shall declare emancipation in the land, ba'aretz l'chol yosheveha, in the land for all those who dwell there. So I might have thought ba'aretz in b'chutz la'aretz. I might have thought that what the Torah means to say is it applies in Eretz Yisrael and not in chutz la'aretz. Okay. So says the Gemara. Therefore, the Torah says Yovel because it is Yovel mikol makom, telling me that it applies everywhere. Okay, so it's an extra riboy. The Torah is coming to include even chutz la'aretz, but I need that, right? Because otherwise, I would have thought that ba'aretz is limiting that it's only in Eretz Yisrael, not in chutz la'aretz, right? And rather, the Torah is including it, and what we mean to say is ba'aretz means in the land, meaning anywhere in the world. Ba'aretz means in the world, not in Eretz Yisrael. Okay. Now, imkain ma Talmud lomar ba'aretz. Okay. Now, if that's the case, that it applies even in chutz la'aretz, why did the Torah write ba'aretz? Why did the Torah write in the land, right, which seems to indicate that it applies only in Eretz Yisrael? If that's not what it means, if that wasn't the intent, so then why write it? It should have just said "Ukrasem dror," that you shall declare emancipation, right? And then I would have known that it applies everywhere. So why does the Torah write ba'aretz in the land if it's not intended to teach me only in Eretz Yisrael? So says the Gemara, "Bisman shahadror noheg ba'aretz, noheg b'chutz la'aretz. Ein dror noheg ba'aretz, eno noheg b'chutz la'aretz." So what it's teaching me is that that the halacha only applies in Chutz La'aretz for as long as it applies in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, meaning when you have to keep Yovel in Eretz Yisrael, which is only when you have the majority of the people living in the land and living in their proper place, in their proper portions in the land. So you need the majority of the Shavatim of the tribes living in Eretz Yisrael. Not only do they have to be living in Eretz Yisrael, but they have to have their proper portion, right? Which ended actually before the destruction of the first temple, before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. It ended when Sancheiriv came and exiled the 10 Shavatim. Okay, so Sancheiriv came and he exiled the 10 Shavatim. So Yovel ended already then. Okay, because you no longer had the majority of the tribes living in their proper place in Eretz Yisrael. So Yovel ended actually even prior to the I forget how many years prior it is already, but it ended actually years prior to the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. Okay, so what the Torah is teaching me is that when Yovel no longer applies in Eretz Yisrael, that it no longer applies in Chutz La'aretz either. Okay?
So it says in the land.
Meaning it's dependent upon the land. Dependent upon the Yovel of the land.
And not where you're necessarily living.
But when it applies in Eretz Yisrael, it applies even in Chutz La'aretz. Exactly. Okay, so it doesn't matter where you're living, but it is dependent upon the Yovel of the land, that it only applies for as long as Yovel is in effect in Eretz Yisrael. So again, this Mansha Hadror Noeg Ba'aretz, when emancipation, when the Yovel applies in Eretz Yisrael, Noeg B'chutz La'aretz, then it applies in Chutz La'aretz as well. However, Ein Dror Noeg Ba'aretz, if it does not apply in Eretz Yisrael, Ein Noeg B'chutz La'aretz, then it will not apply in Chutz La'aretz either. Okay. Tanan Hassam, we learned there, and this is a Mishnah in Orla. There's a Mishnah in Mesechus Orla, which is in Zerayim, and the Mishnah tells me Hachadash Asur Min HaTorah B'chol Makom. Chadash is forbidden Min HaTorah on a Doraisa level B'chol Makom, in all places, even outside of Eretz Yisrael. Orla Halacha. Orla applies because of a halacha, which is not entirely clear. The Gemara is going to explain what does it mean halacha. Okay. V'haklayim midivrei sofim, and klayim applies midivrei sofim only midrabana. Okay, so we understand two of them. Chadash is doraisa. Okay, kalayim is only midrabanan. Okay, orla is halacha, which is unclear, sort of vague. What exactly does that mean? My halacha. So what does that mean halacha? Amar Rabbi Yehudah Amar Shmuel Hilchasa Medina. What we mean to say is that it is midrabanan. Hilchasa Medina in Higuhu Haim Alehem b'chutz la'aretz, that Klal Yisrael accepted it upon themselves even in chutz la'aretz, but it's not deoraisa. Okay. Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Ula, however, says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that it's a halacha l'Moshe Misinai, which means it's a equivalent to a doraisa. It's not exactly a doraisa because it's not written clearly in the Torah that it applies in chutz la'aretz, but it was a halacha taught to Moshe that that it applies even in chutz la'aretz. Okay? Amar le Ula lo Rabbi Yehudah. So Ula said to Rabbi Yehudah, Bishlama ledidi, the Amina halacha l'Moshe Misinai, that it makes sense according to me that Orla applies as a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Okay, so then the halacha makes sense. Hainu deshanilan ben, which halacha? So as we're going to see, Hainu deshanilan ben safek Orla l'safek klayim. It makes sense that there's a distinction in halacha. There's a halachic distinction between Orla and Kalaya Kerem, between a case of Orla and Kalayim, between a suffix, the case of doubt of Orla was a case of doubt of Orla, right? You're not sure if it's within 3 years or not within 3 years, right? Or you're not sure if this produce came from within 3 years of this tree's growth or after that, okay? The suffix Kalayim to a case of suffix Kalayim where you have a case of you have a fruit which you're not sure whether it came from a grafting, whether it came from a mixture, or it didn't come from a mixture. Okay, Ditzan. What are we referring to? We learned in the Mishnah. Okay, we probably won't get to this. Safek Orla ba'aretz asur b'surya muter b'chutz la'aretz yored v'lokeach. Okay, uvalvad shelo yerenu loket. Right. I think we'll pause here because this gets started in a whole discussion. So we'll pick up with this